Well, it's mid-afternoon, Friday, September the 8th. Fall is getting closer, but it's still summer weather. And I can hang on to summer a little while longer, too. Today, I thought I would give you a history lesson. Now, this is partly about sections of our country, a little bit, just what little bit I know, but it's more about a family history than it is world history. I'm going to start back after the Civil War, or during the Civil War, actually, because I've been told I had an uncle named Jesse Ben. Jesse Ben was a pilot for the Union Army. Now, you know, in the South, in the Mid-South, families were divided between the Confederacy and the Union Army. You had brothers fighting for both armies. Now, with Jesse Ben as a pilot for the Union Army, I don't really know what a pilot does, except he leads people. And in this case, he was leading families out of Virginia through Tennessee into the state of Kentucky for their safety. And they had to go through a gap. That was Cumberland Gap. Now we're talking about a tri-state area. The three states come together. And I remember going to a family reunion once, and a cousin was there that I don't think I'd ever met her before. And she said that her family lived in the tri-state. Their house was located in Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Set right on the spot where the three states came together. Well, I was fascinated with that. I said, I can't imagine such a thing, living in three states. And she said, well, we would eat breakfast in Kentucky, we would sleep in Tennessee, and we'd sit in the parlor in Virginia. Well, I found that a humorous, quite interesting little story, and I've never forgotten it, because anytime I go that way, if I'm going into Virginia or going through Kentucky, Middlesboro, and Cumberland Gap, I remember my cousin's story about living in the three states. Now, one thing I can tell you about Cumberland Gap, why it is actually a gap, is because during the Civil War, families had to escape to safety, and they would be guided by Jesse Ben at night through the gap. The gap was also part of the Wilderness Road. Now, if you know any history at all, you've heard of the Wilderness Road. Wilderness Road went right straight through the middle of Cumberland Gap. And another thing I know is that when you're there, you'll discover that you don't see the sun in the morning till it's almost noon. The gap is down in between the mountains, and it takes that long for the sun to get up high enough that the Cumberland Gap has sunshine. And my first thought was, oh, I couldn't live here, not getting but about a half a day of sunshine. But that's another thing I always remembered. Now, we're moving into 1900. That's 123 years ago. My dad's mother was gone, and in 1910, his father passed, and all of his brothers and sisters had married. Some had moved to Texas, some had moved to California, and others were still in the local area. They were farmers. But there was my dad, 13 years old. What was he going to do? Well, he went to live with his sister, but he was the youngest of 11 children. Uncle John was the oldest. Uncle John had children older than my dad. In other words, my dad had several nieces and nephews older than he was. But Uncle John took my dad under his wing and helped him. He had a farm. He raised a lot of produce, and in Cumberland Gap at that time, there was what was called the iron furnace. Some of you know about the iron furnace. Most of you in other states have never heard of it. I can't really describe it to you. It was built of huge stones in kind of like a pyramid, and was lined with bricks. And it was for smelting iron ore. Uncle John and my dad would search for scrap metal, anything that could be taken to the iron furnace and sold. They also took produce to the market in Middlesboro and to Cumberland Gap and sold to the residents there. Now, when they went to Cumberland Gap, they went by wagon, and they would come from Ewing, Virginia. From Ewing to Cumberland Gap was about 15 miles by wagon. That's the only way you could go. So they were loaded with all of the produce and whatever scrap metal they could find. Excuse me. So they would take the wagon into Cumberland Gap. That took all day. 15-mile journey was all day. They would spend the night sleeping in the wagon, and the next day they sold all their materials and their produce, and the third day they went back home. Now, it was 1906 when Uncle John moved his family to Cumberland Gap. 1906, that would be 117 years ago. I can read from an article that was written in the small town newspaper. This article was in 2016. And the person being interviewed for this story was my cousin Dallard. Dallard was Uncle John's son. He grew up with my dad. And I'm going to read portions of the article to you because I can't tell it like he's told it. this is fine print, so it's kind of hard for me to see it. I may have to use my magnifying glass. Think I will. Dad had a little farm out past Big Spring Union on the edge of Hancock County. He grew produce there on the farm close to the Powell River, and he would bring it by wagon to Cumberland Gap and Middlesboro to sell it. He felt Cumberland Gap offered a good opportunity for us, so we moved here in 1906. Dad went into business with a man named Jones, selling produce, turkeys, eggs, chicken, lumber, hay, sugar, salt, feed, and groceries. Some things like turkeys, eggs, and chickens were bought locally, but many things were brought in on the train that'd get a whole carload of lumber or hay at that time. Dallard explained that many residents from Claiborne and surrounding counties raised turkeys in the early part of the last century, which was 1900. I remember the turkey drive they had back before 1920. The spry mayor grinned. I forgot to tell you, he was mayor of Cumberland Gap. They had turkey drives from Speedwell to Ewing, buying the big birds as they went along. There would be a man on a mule leading, and the turkeys followed behind. He'd be watching out for cars or wagons approaching. Back then, you'd only see about 1 or 2 cars a day. He'd motion them to pull over until all the turkeys passed. In fact, there was only 1 car, and the local doctor, I remember being told, the local doctor owned a Maxwell. He was the first car owner in Cumberland Gap, and my Uncle John owned the first washing machine. The turkey drive would take 2 or 3 days. When it started getting dark, the turkeys would fly up into the trees and start roosting. Ewing was a shipping center early in the century, and the turkeys would be put on the train there. Now, Dallard said that in the early days, there were 4 doctors, there were 2 drugstores, 2 hardware stores, a barber shop, clothing store, theater, 3 hotels, and 4 grocery stores. Now that's a lot of business in a small community like Cumberland Gap. I also remember that my Aunt Minerva ran one of those hotels. Now the train station was down by the tunnel. Trains would come in from Knoxville. They'd stop at the station right by the tunnel entrance, and passengers would get off, and then the train would go on through the tunnel to Middlesboro, Kentucky, and it would come back late in the day and stop there at the tunnel entrance, and anybody going back to Knoxville would get on the train and head back. That was a one-time trip daily. So Dallard's older brother, Carl, had a little red wagon. You could hear the train coming, and he would hurry down to the station with his red wagon. He would meet the drummers coming in on the train. Now, you know what a drummer is. A drummer was a traveling salesman, and the traveling salesman came every day into Cumberland Gap with their suitcases. So there was Carl with his red wagon, and for a nickel, he would haul their suitcases into the hotel. Somewhere along the line, I learned that Aunt Minerva served dinner at the hotel for the resident there and for the traveling salesman, and dinner cost 35 cents. So that's just a little bit of what I've learned over the years, and there's a lot more I could tell you. So I want to see what else is in this that I can tell you about. Actually, when Jesse Ben was taking the families through the Gap, he was taking them to Owsley County, Kentucky, because in most cases, wherever the families went, they had relatives already living there. Now, Dallard tells about the People's Bank. People's Bank was right across the street from Uncle John's house. There was a little post office right on the corner. The house was next, and then from there to the end of that block was their yard, covered a whole block. The Wilderness Road came right down the hill, straight down in front of their house. He tells about the day the bank was robbed back in the early 1930s. He said there was a young fellow that lived over on the edge of Lee County, which is Virginia, whose last name was Denny. He came up through the flooring of the bank, and when the bank teller arrived for work, he robbed him and locked him in the bank vault. That's just one of my cousin's stories that he was telling the newspaper reporter. She also said at the age of 91 years, this is my cousin, not my uncle, he was the oldest mayor in Tennessee. When I interviewed him in 1993, very few have lived as long or as fully as he. He lived to age 98. Listen to what I'm telling you here. He lived to the age of 98, as did his brother Carl. His sister Nola lived to be 100. His father had lived to be 100, passing away on his first and only hospitalization. Think about that. He was 100 years old the first time he ever went into a hospital. That was my Uncle John. Now, I had a picture here a minute ago. I wanted you to see what he looked like. Now, to me, this is quite a history. I remember my sister and I were living in Tennessee, and we were in an antique mall one day, and these two men came in, and we recognized one of them. It was our cousin Dallard with a younger man. Dallard was 97 years old, the oldest mayor in the United States. It was shortly after that he resigned his position as mayor, and his reason was because his vision was getting bad. 97-year-old mayor. Now this, if that was in, golly Moses, that was already past the year 2000 when we met him in this antique mall. We asked, why are you coming here into another town, going through an antique mall? My uncle and my cousin had tried to build up the community. It had gone down. The iron furnace was no longer being used, so you just had a small town with very few shops, drugstore, little small restaurant, schools, churches, that sort of thing. You had the Wilderness Road and 4 or 5 little streets that branched off from the Wilderness Road, and all of those houses were near 100 years old. And you could look back up behind my uncle's house, and there was the Pinnacle. Very steep Pinnacle. My cousin Nola used to tell us that when she was young and in high school, she and her friends would climb the mountain to the Pinnacle. Now I'm talking about when you looked up, you looked straight up at that Pinnacle. It was way up there. It was also up there as you came from Kentucky into Tennessee at the Gap. There was a place called Cudjoe's Cave. Cudjoe's Cave during the Civil War was called the Soldiers' Cave. That's where they would hide when the enemy came through the community. And that's where my cousin Nola and their friends, they would crawl through Cudjoe's Cave on their bellies. Time after time when we went to visit my uncle, we would beg Mom and Daddy to stop at Cudjoe's Cave. We want to see Cudjoe's Cave. There was no way my mother was going to let us step our foot inside that cave. And I really don't think she had anything to worry about, because we wouldn't have gone more than 50 feet because we would have been too scared. But Nola said they would go through the cave, and it would take them half a day to get to the top of the mountain at the Pinnacle, and by then they had to turn around, go back down the mountain, because they had to be home in time for supper. That was their livelihood, their fun. Now I have stood on the edge of that cliff at the Pinnacle. It's fenced off, and you can see, I think on a clear day you can probably see 50 miles away. But what I do is I lean forward and I look straight down. And when I do, the first thing I see is the roof of my uncle and cousin's house. Because when Aunt Minerva died, Uncle John stayed in the house, and my cousin Dallard and his wife moved in, and they had a daughter named Ann. Ann became an elementary school teacher. She never married. And when they were all gone, she was still living in the home place on the Wilderness Road right next to the old post office that they owned. And when Ann died, the house was sold. And to my knowledge, it's an Airbnb now. Now, the next time I take a trip to Cumberland Gap, I think I'm going to make reservations there, because I can remember going in the house and the most beautiful antique furniture. Everything in that house was antique. They took care of everything. And I always remembered the beautiful furniture. And sitting in the kitchen, and Ann said, "Look out the window. Look up." And I did. And I was looking straight up at the Pinnacle. And I could imagine what it looked like in the wintertime when it snowed. It had to be a beautiful place. It's a very small community now. I'm trying to think if I've left anything out that I wanted you to know about Cumberland Gap. But I did want you to know that it's been over 100 years that one family lived there. The children were born there. They've all died there. My Uncle John, at the age of 100, he died there too. So, next time if you ever wonder who was ever the oldest mayor in the United States, it was my cousin Dallard at the age of 97. Who else do you know was still productive at that age? But he was. And he and his young friend from California had come into the antique mall, I think, to see about drumming up business adventures for people. Would they want to put an antique shop in Cumberland Gap? And they did. They had antique shops. So the last time Jan and I went there, they were having their summer festival. Oh, it's fun. They've got all kinds of food, barbecue, and the people have their own written materials about the history of that community. You can hear all kinds of stories told. I've already told you about the Indian warfare with the Cherokee Indians. That's right there in that same 3 states, that territory. That's where all of that took place. And it has a history of its own. I think you would love going to Cumberland Gap. I think you would enjoy the festival, because every group, family, whatever, that's set up, I won't call it a booth because they were scattered out all around, and you could get any kind of food you wanted, and you could buy booklets and handmade crafts, all kinds of handmade crafts, and you could hear the personal history of Cumberland Gap. So, Jan says, I want to go to the drugstore. It was the old drugstore, still like it had been 100 years ago. Everything in it, and people loved to go there. And all you would get was maybe a sandwich and a milkshake. They had the old-fashioned milkshake maker. You just couldn't walk away without ordering a milkshake. And you would look and look and look at all of the materials in that drugstore. So, Jan said, there's a sign on the door. The drugstore's closed. So one of the vendors said, oh yes. He said a few years ago, and I do remember when this happened, that the druggist or the owner of the drugstore went into his pharmacy one morning, opened the doors, get things ready for business, and a man came in and robbed him and killed him. So the family decided they would close the doors to the drugstore and it would never be opened again. So this was a big disappointment to us. We had looked forward to going in the drugstore and sitting at little Formica table and chairs, or sitting at the counter where they made the milkshakes in a 100-year-old drugstore. So that's a little of what I call my family history, because East Step Grocery was right across the street from the house and from the bank. And my Uncle John ran that grocery until he retired in his 80s. And he used to come and visit us. He'd take the train from Middlesboro to Corbin, and he'd spend a week with us, sometimes 2 weeks. And Daddy was usually off on a job somewhere. He'd just be there on the weekend. But that didn't matter to Uncle John. He enjoyed being with our family. And one thing, my sister and my brother and I were in school, and he would tell us stories. He told about the first train he ever saw. And it was one of those little chug, chug, chug engines, and the whistle going. And when the train would come along, and they were in their buggy, and they blew that whistle, it scared the horses. The horses would rear up, and they had runaway horses, and everybody had been thrown from the buggy. And then they were chasing the horses. Well, that doesn't sound much like a story, but when someone tells it that remembers it and was a part of it, it's a fabulous story to hear. And you think, the first train, what that must have been like. I would love to just been able to see a video of something like that. But it was my grandparents that were in that buggy with my cousin Dallard and my Uncle John. So I remember those little things. And I hope you have a family history like that too, that you can remember the strange, unusual, very different incidents and very different way of life. Sometimes I want to go back in time, get on that time machine and go back and see just a little bit of it. Don't want to live in that era, because I like indoor plumbing, and I like air conditioning, and I like running water. So I hope you've enjoyed this history lesson. And you can go probably on the internet, and anything you want to check off. You can learn about the iron furnace. You can learn about the salesmen that were called drummers. You can read about and learn about the tunnel. Now, it was, what year was it? 1991 that they built the tunnel from Middlesboro to Cumberland Gap for highway traffic. You always had to take the 2-lane road around the mountain to get to Cumberland Gap until they built the long tunnel. And just a few years ago, I was in a riding group. And one of the ladies in the riding group was a geologist. And somewhere along the line, I must have mentioned in my storytelling about Cumberland Gap. And she said I was one of the geologists that helped build the tunnel. I thought that was kind of nice that I got to meet someone like that. She's a very good writer, too. I haven't seen her since then. But she was a geologist that built the highway 4-lane tunnel between Middlesboro and Cumberland Gap. If you're ever down that way, you really need to go. And I suggest you pack a picnic lunch. You go up to the iron furnace. They've got a little park there, and they've got picnic tables. And running right down beside the tunnel, the iron furnace, and the picnic table is a creek. That's the same creek that came out of the mountain that they used the water or the iron furnace. It is so quiet and peaceful, shady. It's just a delightful place to sit and eat a picnic lunch. So, if you ever get the chance to go, take advantage of it. For those who live within 200 miles of it, it's worth the trip. Now take a look over my shoulder, over my left shoulder. What do you see? See that right there? And you see that right there? And you see that right there? Now, you don't have to ask me what's the name of your book. There they are. But from where I'm looking, I can't see the words on this book very well. So I'll tell you what it said. Hold it, Lord, hold it. I'm not finished yet. You know what I mean. I got stories to tell and things to do. And people to meet. And money to make. Yeah. Gotta sell a few books. So folks, you have a good evening. Hope you've got something good for supper. I can't think of anything, but I might just have a good scrambled egg sandwich, which is as good as anything you can have as far as I'm concerned. You take care. I'm glad you're with me. Tell me what you think of my story. I always want feedback. Thank you.